Hi everyone, my name is Kent C. Dodds and I'm joined by my friend Guillermo Rausch. Say hi, Guillermo.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for having me.
Super happy to have you here. Guillermo and I go back. Actually, you probably don't know, but I knew of you way before you knew of me because I used Socket.io way back in the day, and I loved it. It was awesome. I built this app called Why Is X So, and it was just like this text that said why is, and then it had an input, and then so, and then you type in the input like anything, and then it would give you back results from like Bing or Google, what they would auto suggest for that query. So like why is or you could actually change it to why are dogs so, and it would say like silly or whatever, and I use Socket.io for that. Really fun, cool. So my first exposure to WebSockets, so thank you for making that easy for me. um, and then a few years ago now, you tweeted something that kind of exploded in my universe. That was write tests, not too many, mostly integration. And I love that so much. I made a blog post about it and a talk, and many of the people watching this have probably heard of that blog post. Actually, it's one of my more popular posts. So
I send it to everybody, so thanks for making the blog post.
yeah,
Because
I
like tweets are
hopefully.
easy to do, right? Like like I remember where I was that day. It's like tweet, but actually explaining and elaborating on the concept is the hard part. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah, I hope that I did your concept justice
Thank
in
you.
that way. So yeah, and I remember when now.sh came out, when you released Zeit Now, and Ryan Florence was like, dude, this is game changing, this is amazing. And I didn't quite get it. I wasn't quite there at first. I was like, okay, so because I had been using Netlify, and for my front end stuff, or no, it was Surge SH is what I was using back then for my front end stuff, and it was awesome because they had, their like everything was deployed totally isolated. You deploy a new thing, you get a totally new thing separate from the old one. And when Ryan was like, it's basically like Surge for the backend, and I was like, oh, mind blown. I don't really do backend, so I don't really care all that much, but that sounds awesome. um, and I've done a little bit more back end recently, and so that's been kind of interesting. But yeah, and that now SH has transitioned over to Vercel, and then you release Next.js and just all kinds of stuff. So I'd love to hear more about all of this. But before we get into that, I'd love for you to introduce yourself to folks. Anything else that I didn't say that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah. So my background is in open source. Most notably, like you said, Socket.io and Mongoose. Mongoose is I think in the JavaScript world is the most popular ODM, object document mapper, like object relational mapper. I've always been in the JS community, Node.js first. And funny enough, my thing for the longest time has been front end development. And the creation of Next.js has to do with basically not just exposing React to everyone in the world and making it really accessible, really easy to create a production ready app, but also providing sort of this sort of front end platform so that people can straddle from one static page to more dynamic sort of serverless experiences. So the gap that we found in the market is, you know, um, front end is becoming possibly the most impactful part of the stack. Backend is becoming commoditized. You can buy backends off the shelf like headless CMSs, headless e-commerce, Twilio, Stripe. They'll do all the backend for you. Um, GraphQL, Hasura, Prisma, etc. So the meat of all the efforts around creating great products and great experiences is in building sophisticated, powerful, interactive front ends. So Next.js was sort of the pivotal moment for us that made us realize, that's where things are headed.
Yeah, I so agree with you. Like, so Epic React is super focused on the React aspect of this. We don't do any backend stuff, and we do build an app. It's this bookshelf app, but it is 100% client side. I don't show you any of the back end stuff. And it's actually intentional. Like part of me is like, maybe I should do, I want people to be able to come here and then leave being able to build a whole app. But they can, because we have all of these backends as a service. Like it is so
Totally.
commoditized now, just as you were saying.
Totally.
Do you think
Commoditized, and
Go
also,
ahead.
by the way, that because I think when we say commoditized, maybe if backend people are listening to us, maybe we're
Yeah.
downplaying their efforts. But I think it's basically that there's a certain degree of specialization that's happening, where I always give people this little metaphor of when Ruby on Rails came out, DHH in the famous screencast built a blog, and he shows off how he can sort of scaffold, maintain, and run the database for the blog, create an admin panel for the blog, and so on and so forth. And if you sort of fast forward to today, a lot of people are like, I wonder if I can find the Ruby on Rails for the front end. And some people have called Next.js that, but what I always emphasize is that, look, today, if I'm going to give you value, if I'm going to teach you how to build a blog, my personal recommendation today would be to use a headless CMS, someone that has already built all that backend. No matter how much you can automate and code generate and scaffold, what's the point, And I think the opportunity for backend engineers then becomes, why don't, raise the bar of abstraction and focus on creating these reusable services. So obviously, both backend and frontend are exploding, but in slightly different ways.
I totally agree with that. It's interesting that like we see people complaining about how difficult it is to get started in the web, and it like, granted, it's not easy stuff. Like you're working hard. But the things that we're able to build with the just plug and play services that we have now are, it was just a pipe dream even a decade ago.
And by the way, what you're saying is something I've given a lot of thought to, which is this idea of why does it seem like it's perpetually difficult, complex, hard to do front end, to build modern web stuff. And I think it's a variety of factors, but it's kind of starts with the visual that I've been giving people recently is the iceberg, where the visible part of the iceberg is the smallest part of the ice block, and interestingly enough, I would say that nowadays is the back end, because what you just said, that you can get one off the shelf, but also that backend as a system is easier to control in some ways. For example, it's very much request response. You can measure whether it's working correctly very easily and quickly. So typically we look for backends that have great availability. So 99.89% of the responses are 200 HTTP status code. And then we look at P99 performance. So we say to the 99th percentile of our requests, they've been responded to in let's say 300 milliseconds or less. And that's where the backend job ends. So it works reliably and it responds fast. When you go into the rest of the ice block, which is front end, the system becomes much more complex because, for example, it's a long running system. It doesn't just respond and end. So if you're going to measure whether your front end has been fast or working correctly, it becomes a much more difficult thing to quantify, to illustrate, to measure, to look at. And then the universe of front end changes rapidly. Whereas in backend, you control sort of the certainty of your cluster. In the front end, you're dealing with an ever-changing shifting platform. It's like shifting sands. The shifting sands of web browsers evolving, the shifting sands of new web browser platforms that become interesting, the shifting sands of what the industry considers the right scores for you to be ranked high on Google or so and so, the shifting sands of how do I make my hyperlinks more shareable on certain platforms. I have to include this open graph thing so that it's shareable on Twitter, on Slack, and this and that. So front is a very dynamic media, and that's why I think things like Epic React are really addressing the substance of what makes today's software development, in my opinion, difficult but also rewarding.
Yeah, I think that is a good point too. Like it's um, at least it's the level of abstraction that we haven't quite genericized enough to be able to package it up
Yeah.
and hand it off to somebody. But I'm actually curious what you think about the no code movement, things like Webflow, and like how long do you think it will be before we can package up a front end?
That's a great question.
Are we going to get Dreamweaver back? Like, is this is this a thing that's in our future?
It's definitely in our future. It's in our present, right? Like one can't. It's enough to just look at the numbers to understand that the rise of no code is very real. And it's very much in my mind like the rise of AI, where Nick Szabo is known for popularizing this concept of the singularity is already here. We've been already beaten by AI in many different domains. I think people are expecting that tomorrow a general AI shows up that completely replicates exactly what we're dealing with today with our brains. That's probably not going to happen. Is that certain domains of capability we get altogether beaten at. So the first
Right.
one was CAPTCHA, right? Like we used to not be able to beat CAPTCHAs with AIs. One day Google announced, speaking of percentiles, at the 99th percent or 99.99, like uh, Google's AI was beating CAPTCHA or solving CAPTCHA better than a human being in terms of like efficacy, right? Like if you present 100 CAPTCHAs, the human being group would lose 2, and the AI group would lose 1. Like when they got to that point, they made that big announcement.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're going to see other domains, very specific narrow domains like translation, image recognition, perhaps driving sometime soon. And I think the same is going to happen with no code. So what has become clear to me is that for a certain amount of simplicity of a front end that mostly presents just content, and where the emphasis is on your ability to sort of not require technical skills in order to quickly adapt it. In the particular narrow domain that I've been seeing, this is marketing and landing pages. The question becomes like, should I really go with like a React approach or a fancy front end approach as opposed to just using a no code tool? And I think it ends up being an economical problem at that point. So there is certain things that are controlling the entire front end experience and using code that no code still struggles with. But then for a kind of a vast array of use cases, it's just cheaper and faster. So that's a particular domain where like no code is starting to claim more and more of the space. And I think there's going to be domains where it's never going to be there because so a bookshelf app, and like I haven't really seen all the details, but like when you start dealing with like talking to a persistence layer, and when you're talking about state and local state and remote state and permissions and responses and error handling and dealing with the network and things that cannot be sort of obviously done by default, no code might even be an impediment where like you start trying to solve it with no code, and then you start thinking like, well, where's the code editor, because I can express logic much better with code than I can express it with what I call obfuscated code. Because when you have an interface that gives you like sort of like pipelines and visual if branches and so on, that's just obfuscated code. And I've always been a big believer on kind of like this always bet on text thing, that I think we tend to underestimate the power of text and sort of the compression value of text. And it turns out that text is really good for expressing our requirements to a computer. And I think code is going to be the tool for a long time to come for all these different domains. And I think, we'll continue to see places where it becomes this economical question of like, oh, maybe I have this no code solution, maybe it solves 90% of the problem, and start there and perhaps evolve into code later on. So to wrap up my current framework of thinking, I was recently talking to one of the co-founders at Shopify, And one of the things that Vercel and Next.js are known for is you can create very high-end front-end experiences, but in particular front-end e-commerce experiences. So at what point is it not enough to just have a point-and-click interface to create your store? Well, for the vast majority of little stores in the world, why give them the quote-unquote curse of code if they can just like manage? But when you're talking about like high-end customers that have very sophisticated, personalized, immersive, custom e-commerce experiences, a lot of them are coming to Next.js. So the concept that we came up with is this idea of ejection. So start no code, but reserve your optionality to eject into code. And the system remains cohesive throughout, meaning that if you're working with a certain component system in the no code interface, when you eject, you get access to the same components, but now you can use code. So that would be kind of we're talking about Elon Musk before the recording started, and one of his big points right now is the AI symbiosis. He talks about like merging with Neuralink. Like if you can't beat them, join them. So I think no code, we're not going to be able to beat it. We have to join it. So like we have to provide experiences to people that they can start with no code and then eject to code.
I actually, that makes tons of sense to me. And so you don't see anybody who's currently working on that, right? Or is there anybody in that
It's
space?
early. It's early. Yeah, it's early. I know that Gatsby has started an initiative called Blocks UI that is certainly in that direction, because Gatsby uses code, obviously, and React and components and so on. But the novel part would be that they could create some sort of like drag and drop UI for it for like the basic cases. And I've seen some CMSs, like headless CMSs that are giving you sort of in-page editing experiences that would make like non-technical people much more much more of a friendly interface for non-technical folks to edit websites, right? And I think that's where like this kind of symbiosis is probably going to show up first.
Yeah, that makes plenty of sense to me. It also comforts me to know that we are in the singularity, and my job isn't gone yet, so that's good.
Yeah, it's all about like I think people always see these things as like, oh, X is gonna destroy Y, and there's always actually a much better world when you merge X and Y.
Yeah, where the sum of the parts is greater than, well, what is that phrase? Whatever.
The total is greater than the sum of the parts, because when you
Right.
combine the parts individually, the total is a thing that you couldn't have had individually. And like usually what we find is the total becomes like incredibly big.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense.
But by the way, I've always struggled with that saying as well.
Yeah.
The spirit of the saying is great, but the saying itself is quite confusing.
Yes, yeah. So you've got Vercel, and you just recently launched. Was it 2.0? Like or that was maybe a year ago, actually. Now that I think about it, so not.
Yeah. So like as you said, we kind of started like prototyping. Okay, the thing we wanted to solve was like, how can you make deploying the fastest, most delightful, and most zero config experience? What we've sort of realized is that what you're deploying is the most interesting piece, right? Like we used to be more broad. You could deploy backend and frontend, but nowadays, and partially due to the success of Next.js, but Next.js was kind of also, the success of Next.js is really indicative of what's happening in the industry as a whole. And deploying front end is just the thing that is most interesting to the world right now. In empowering the front end developer, as we were talking about with that sort of like metaphorical iceberg, is I think where the world will be shaken up the most. I think it's still a big part of our world is kind of attached to the idea of the power is in the infrastructure. The power, like even if you listen to like the way that people sell you cloud stuff, like a lot of them sell you that you're going to have great infrastructure. Whereas my take is like, let's talk to people in the terms of their application or their product. Let's build better UIs. Let's quantify those UIs better. Let's make collaborating on the evolution of a front-end product better. So that's kind of the space of things that Vercel wants to solve.
Yeah, so let's talk about it technically too, because I imagine that some people who are listening to our conversation know what Vercel is, many don't. So do you want to just give like a high level overview of what is Vercel and how does it relate to Next.js?
Yeah. So any modern front-end project today starts with either a framework, a static site generator, or perhaps if you're starting from very, very much from scratch, it starts with an HTML page. And the way that typically you've solved the problem of taking that online has varied a lot over the years, right? Like for some people, it's been email a folder to my IT team. For some people, it's been FTP, a server. For some people, it's been setting up their own sort of manual mesh of systems like Circle CI connected to AWS. But if you think about it from the perspective of front-end developer that wants to just iterate on a great product, that is all undifferentiated infrastructure. It should not really exist.
Yes,
So
yeah, like
Vercel,
it's just getting in the way of me actually doing the thing that I'm trying to do.
totally. And so Vercel, basically, you bring in a repository that contains any of this, either frameworks or sort of setups, and then with a couple clicks, puts it online and solves for a lot of the problems, not just of putting it online, but also iterating on your product. So one of the killer features is deploy previews, which for every push will give you a live URL of your project, such that you can share with the rest of your team. One of the things that Vercel has sort of really uncovered is the need for collaborating on the thing that you're building, not just with your front end team or your peers, but also with the rest of the company. So this is one of the interesting things that we've uncovered. So for example, we just announced nextjs.org/conf. So from the perspective of technically how that works is that, okay, there's a repo called next-site on GitHub. It contains a Next.js project. And it was obviously most of the nextjs.org pages are our documentation. But now we're like, okay, we're going to announce a conference. Let's create a landing page for the conference. So this is a small example of Next.js and Vercel shining. Why? Because the effort of putting together a conference has been a cross-company effort and cross-community effort as well. So like it involved people from our marketing team. It involved people from our engineering team. It involved people from the Next.js open source team. It involved sharing the project and the progress of the project with community partners and sponsors and so on. So every step of the way, instead of working a black box, we're pushing to GitHub. Vercel was automatically deploying. We're getting this URL that now we could share and test the evolution of this conference announcement on. But what has been the most fascinating thing to me is that sharing and that collaboration affected the outcome in a very visible way. So today, we hit in less than 48 hours, 20,000 registrations. We credit a lot of that, we credit a lot of that success to how we structured this page. So like the page, you come to the page, we take in your email, we create a personalized ticket by connecting GitHub with your photo, your username, and then we encourage that you share it to your friends. I actually didn't think that people were going to share it to the extent that they've been sharing it, but that idea that we sort of evolved as we're developing the front end for it, it all came from this collaboration with multiple different people. Like someone would say, oh, how about we do this? How about we do that? How about we change this gradient? How about we generate this image? Oh, how about that when you share it on Twitter, we embed the photo of the ticket on the Twitter card? And so it really changed the way we develop software. Like like this is something you might hear a lot when like entrepreneurs are telling you like how the world is going to be different and whatnot. Like, the other day we're building tools for front-end developers, but I was able to see firsthand how the process definitely impacted the outcome. And our goal is to give that process to basically everyone in the world with just a couple of clicks.
Well, that's a pretty audacious goal, but I think it's a good one. And so years ago, I was at a company called Alianza, and there we deployed the front end to just an AWS bucket, and magic ensued and stuff. And I remember spending a bunch of time making it so that all of our PRs could be deployed, so we could preview that. And I can just like, that is an enormous benefit to like my productivity. So I was able to say, hey, QA person, you don't have to like download my PR and get it running. You just pull it up and make sure it's working. And so yeah, being able to iterate with people who are maybe aren't, and like the product manager as well, people who aren't developers and don't have, you know, all of the dependencies installed all the time, whatever, is an enormous benefit. And I can only imagine the challenges. Like I was just doing front end, that was easy. Doing the back end, you know, I just put a file in a bucket on AWS and like.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, so one of the capabilities that Vercel and the Next.js exposes is serverless functions. So a great example here was we started with a static page, very easy to deploy. You could have done that with an S3 bucket and so on. But then we realized, wait, like when we share the ticket, it needs to render this card, especially when you share it in social media. So we're very lucky that we're using Next.js, because Next.js can do both the static pages and dynamic pages. So what's interesting is that it's not even just about the technical details, but what we really want to enable is there's all this power at your disposal, and then the front-end developer can sort of tap into that power, right? Like instead of just being limited to static files in an S3 bucket, what about when they need to do something that basically comes from this product need at the end of the day, right? Like I want to create more personalized experiences. I want to create more dynamic experiences, and basically not putting any constraints on the developer with how far they can take their front end. Because like I said earlier, front end is becoming more and more immersive of an experience. And that's why I was saying, you know, I think there's a parallel universe where we announced Next.js Conf, which is like, you know, a form that goes into an email box, and maybe we would have gotten a couple thousand registrations. So it was funny to see kind of dog food, our sort of the recipe for success that we want to give companies and individuals, which is investing in the front end will change the future of your software and your company for the better.
Yeah, I think adding those little bits of like, oh, share this and you get this special personalized ticket, and those little things are what differentiates something from like, oh, hey, here's this cool thing, to like, no, you're not listening. Like, I really want to share this with you because it's so cool.
Yeah, and we're seeing that in e-commerce a lot, by the way. Like, sure, like it's nowadays it's easy to put a shop online, you know, sell something. But what's really creating a difference for a lot of brands is to what extent they can make their web experience reflect their values, reflect the knowledge of their customer, turn customers into fans. This is a language of e-commerce today, you know. And again, like the key thing there is the front end. You know, like dispatching an order to a fulfillment center, that's the back end. You know, like it's not going to move the needle for anybody.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting how like it's not even just a software back end that's becoming commoditized. It's also the actual sort of back end of things, like moving bits, but also moving atoms across the world. And what's left is the interaction with the customer.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. So there was another thing I wanted to get your take on, and that is this idea of kind of a like performance related topic or thing, but with frameworks like Next.js or really any server rendered and then client rehydrated type app, there's this idea that people have been talking about where that's not optimal, because you end up downloading the app twice, or at least the HTML. You download the HTML and then you download the JavaScript, and then it rehydrates, and so you're basically sort of downloading the page twice.
Yeah.
So what's your take on this, and what do you think the future is there?
Yeah, so to recap the problem, that a lot of people point out is when you do server rendering or static generation, if you're gonna do more stuff on the client, because you can always server render or generate React and not
Mm.
use any client code.
Yeah,
But when
that was my first website. Actually, was all like generated with like little scripts that I made. I wrote the whole thing in React, but then I made little scripts that just saved it to an index HTML file, and that's all it sent. And it
right,
was pretty bad.
yeah, no, I mean it works, right? It's very durable. But the problem with that is like, okay, like people want to do more on the client. Like I think that Next.js does, for example, is that it'll prefetch all the other pages as they enter viewport, such that all the clicks you make are instant. And we can do that not only for code, but we can also do that for data, and we can do all kinds of interesting client side things. So routing also happens in the client. We can do things like obviously creating interactive, rich experiences when you hover, interact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So people have pointed out that you're repeating the data in the form of the HTML and JSON. The misconception there is that that's what's creating a slow experiences, and it's not. So for example, Next.js will pack the JSON in a way that is extremely fast for the browser to parse and is very small as far as the entirety of the payload goes. So maybe a page that is 20 kilobytes of HTML has 2 kilobytes of extra JSON. If you deleted that, your performance profile would pretty much be the same. That's why, for example, nextjs.org, I think it was the creator of Eleventy that just created a leaderboard of Lighthouse's scores over time for this, and for the static site generation category, we're number 3. And interestingly enough, and we're hydrating, we have all the JSON data in there and whatnot, but also we're a much more complex website than perhaps a lot of others on the list. And if we deleted I think we're like 98 Lighthouse. And if we deleted the JSON, we would still be at 98 Lighthouse. Actually, the thing that's going to bring us from 98 to 100 is one attribute and script tags, which a future version of Next.js will use automatically. So the misconception there is really that moves the needle. And what we've found that actually moves the needle at scale by examining the corpus of data from the entire web is things like images. It's things like third-party scripts. It's things like sometimes it's painting performance, like misusing web fonts, misusing CSS. So, and again, that's why I like the metaphor of the eyes, of the gigantic piece of eyes that front end is. I very much like the Web Vitals effort, because the Web Vitals effort is saying, okay, there's these 3 metrics. Those are the Web Vitals, the important, the beating heart of a good performance. And none of those metrics are what is the payload size that you're receiving from the CDN or from a server or whatever. It basically doesn't matter. Sure, it could matter in some cases, but you would have to infer that by looking at the aggregate data of Web Vitals from your customers, right? So like this is another important thing, is that a lot of people perform sort of audits of Lighthouse, which is what I call in the lab, which is they simulate a Lighthouse test that simulates a device. But what's interesting on Web Vitals, and starting with Next.js 9.4, we have a hook that allows you to sort of send the telemetry back very easily. It's called Report Web Vitals. Now you get sort of the Lighthouse score, but from the perspective of your actual customers. So I'll give you an example. Like one of the core tenets of web performance is let's be fast, not just for the first world, but also for the emerging markets, right? To accomplish that, we simulate a Moto 3G device. That's sort of the default Lighthouse test, is simulating a device that people are likely to have in an emerging market, which is great because it configures a lower bound of performance. And then if you meet that, of course, you're going to meet an iPhone 11. But however, what's interesting is that with Web Vitals being reported by Next.js to you, now you actually get the data of what devices are representative of your customers. Maybe you have a lot in the emerging markets. Maybe you have more in other, and maybe for whatever reason, like the painting performance is worse on Chrome or Safari, or time to contentful paint is really bad on mobile browsers, but you hadn't noticed. So I like this holistic approach to performance analysis that begins with your customers and sort of understanding what their experiences are like. And also throughout the process of development, you want to ensure that certain guardrails are met, right? Like you can of course look at like the payload size of the HTML response, you can look at the JS bundle sizes, but you always have to be, I think, remember that like the iceberg contains things like images and web fonts and tracking scripts and analytics scripts and pixels for advertising and so on.
Yeah, I like that perspective a lot. Like nothing actually matters until it's the user's machine and the user's
Yes,
experience. That maps really well to my testing philosophy of the more your tests resemble the way your
totally.
software is used, the more confidence they can give you. So,
And
um,
this is why like companies like Netflix, for example, like they take this to the extreme for testing, right? Like they roll out experiments and then it's like they're testing in prod, right? They're rolling out experiments with progressive rollout schemes with automatic rollback behaviors based on the increase of error rates and the sort of impact to their business metrics. So that's the ultimate form of testing at the end of the day. Because like again,
yeah,
end-to-end testing also simulates a lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, and again, this is not going to be relevant until for a lot of folks you get to Netflix's scale. But like at
sure.
the end of the day, like the only legitimate test is I roll it out to real people, and my business metrics have not been impacted. It's not even about errors, right? Like, oh, something through. It's kind of like that XKCD comic where like it says that someone rolled a software update and then a user was complaining because the fan in the computer overheating. The user was using it as a heating device. They were using it,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, and like that's the thing. Is like maybe your exception, and again it's not realistic, but like at the end of the day, like something like an exception is a signal. At the end of the day, like you probably want to look at other things. Like if you're in an e-commerce store, you're looking at revenue. You're looking at cart abandonment rates. You're looking at like when you are constantly spending money on advertising, like what is the engagement or what is the sort of bounce rate, like how is the performance of the site changing that and so on. Like there's actually funny enough been documented cases where like a little bit of a slowdown in certain processes produces more user satisfaction, right? Like
Hmm.
Uber and like not making things too instantaneous can sometimes be better in certain very narrow segments. And I don't advocate for that as a philosophy, obviously, but it really comes from this perspective of like, let's look at higher and higher metrics for understanding whether the software is working or not.
Yeah, yeah, that makes tons of sense. I could talk about this stuff with you forever, but we've reached the end of our time. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention? I didn't really dive too deep into Vercel or Next. We kind of talked more high level. So if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about, we can wrap up with that.
No, I actually encourage people to check out Next.js because for me, the pain point that it solved was it was very hard for React to do pages, which is funny because pages are like sort of the fundamental primitive of the web, but um, no framework had put pages as sort of the um, entry point into the abstraction, into the framework, et cetera, et cetera. And for people that have not been up to date on Next.js for a while, my favorite thing as of recently has been that the developer can now choose on a per page basis whether that page will be static, whether it'll be SSR, or even whether it'll be a hybrid, which is what we call incremental static generation. So it's a pretty innovative concept, and I expect a lot of frameworks to follow in the future with this idea of a hybrid framework. And the best way to sort of learn that trajectory from very basic stuff to more complex is our tutorial on nextjs.org/learn. And yeah, check it out and send us feedback.
Awesome. Yeah. And actually that I don't know if you've heard of the KCD Learning Clubs thing that I've been doing recently, but it's like this uh, initiative to get people who want to learn about the same thing together. And
Oh,
I
nice.
create a special place for them in my Discord. But that would be a perfect thing for somebody to go through that material together. So if anybody's interested in making a learning club on Next.js, give that a look for sure.
For sure.
Cool. Hey, thank you so much for giving me some of your time. And where's the best place for people to find you on the web?
Twitter, Rauch G is my handle, RAUCHG. And yeah, send me your thoughts.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We'll see y'all later.